Hi there. I just want to answer some of your questions for this week. Before I do that, just to mention that I have made some significant changes to the class recently in order to be very accommodating towards our present situation with COVID-19. Please let me know if there's anything else I can do to help you to be successful in this class. And I will now, please, if you haven't seen it yet, have a look at the announcement that describes some of these changes. Yeah. So we're talking about fascism this week, and the first question that I want to look at is this one that deals with the Enlightenment. At least it mentions the Enlightenment at the beginning, but we'll see the sort of focus of the question change a little bit. But I want to start here. I think in terms of the Enlightenment, in terms of fascism, it's worth looking at fascism as something that's a 20th century phenomenon. It comes around in the 20th century. It's a rejection of liberalism, and it's a rejection of socialism. Remember, liberalism is our first ideology that comes along, and that's heavily based in the Enlightenment. We've got 5 premises in the textbook there of the Enlightenment, which are humanism, rationalism, secularism, progressivism, and universalism. So liberalism is very much the sort of political ideology, the first political ideology, and it's based in the Enlightenment. Remember, conservatism, that's the first sort of objection to liberalism that comes along fairly immediately. And then later on, socialism comes along. Socialism is also, for the book, and this is going to be very relevant as we come to answer the question, but socialism is also heavily based in the Enlightenment: humanism, rationalism, secularism, progressivism, and universalism. If you're not clear on sort of the background or the meaning of those isms, those 5 premises of the Enlightenment, it's very well worth having a look at the textbook. I'll do a very brief one here just to sort of whet your appetite. But humanism is the idea that human beings, people, they belong to the kingdom of ends, which is all that means is that human beings are ends in themselves. They're not means to an end. We don't use people to get to somewhere, somewhere different. We don't use people for our own benefit or for the benefit of an entity. No, human beings are ends in themselves, roughly speaking. Okay, rationalism, very quickly. I'll go into this in actually a little bit more detail. I'll discuss this more because there's a question specifically about rationalism, but basically that human beings are rational, can be rational, and that being rational is the way to get what you want. Weighing up alternatives, understanding cause and effect, right? Those sorts of things are to do with rationalism, and let's discuss that in a little bit more detail a little bit later on. Secularism, the idea that actually now we've moved past, right, and liberalism was very famous for this, right, in the early days of liberalism. We've moved past sort of prescribed religion, but we've in lots of ways moved past religion. Right? Religion belongs to the irrational, sort of non-logical realm, oftentimes for liberals, and so secularism. Maybe some liberals were religious, right? Well, absolutely, some liberals were religious, but where they were religious, they insisted that a person's religion remain in the private sphere. Right? That's a private system of beliefs that's between me and God, and I don't, and has no place or very little, very limited indeed, place in the public space, right? For liberals, and again, what we're going through here is not liberalism, but the 5 premises of the Enlightenment. Progressivism, right? That we can, the human beings using their own rationality and using their own, we can progress, right? We can improve. We can make changes to the way we live, and those changes will result in a better life for everyone. Think of science as well, goes in with that. We can use science, rational sciences, to enhance our lifestyle. And then universalism, the idea that human beings are human beings wherever they are. Natural law exists everywhere at the same time. There's no different rules if you're born in Russia, or if you're born in the United States of America, or if you're in India, if you're an Indian, or in India, or if you're in Africa or Europe. People are the same, and the same laws exist everywhere for everyone. Right? we're not sort of cultural relativists in the case of the Enlightenment. Conservatives very much one of the objections to one of their big objections to liberalism was that you behave, you talk about human nature or sort of universal human rights or something like that, the rights of man. But the rights of a Frenchman are different from the rights of an Englishman, say conservatives, which is a rejection of that Enlightenment principle of universalism. So, been through those. So, the 5 premises of Enlightenment, which we just discussed, seem to coincide with a lot of beliefs of socialism and liberalism. So, yes, liberalism uses it. Conservatism questions big parts of the Enlightenment, especially universalism, I think, and secularism as well. Think of what we talked about with Joseph de Maistre, crown and altar and all of that. So conservatism did reject elements of the Enlightenment. Socialism is the next competitor to liberalism, and that comes up, and that actually adopts many of the same Enlightenment principles. I think socialists could sign on to all 5 of those premises of the Enlightenment. So socialism comes and takes on liberalism with this. So we're already sort of answering the question here. I'm a little bit ahead of myself, which is good, I suppose, because I've used quite a bit of time. However, fascism is similar with socialism. This is the question again, remember. However, fascism is similar with socialism because both want one party, albeit different ones, right? So working class versus government. And I would amend that from working class versus government to, I can see why you put government, but I'd say working class versus nation or something like that, right? Nation. More than government, although they're going to use the nation state, right, the government, in order to, but of course, so the working class in socialism, right? So to have control over the means of, so they want one party to have control over means of production, with fascism seeming to only take it one step further, wanting to control everything. And let's mention totalitarianism there, right? Let's separate totalitarianism out from fascism and socialism. Let's say that totalitarianism, well, let's separate it out only briefly. I'm going to bring it back in very quickly because certainly socialist governments have also been totalitarian in the case of the Soviet Union, for example, but not necessarily so, right? Socialism isn't, well. So the reason why I'm hesitating is I'm thinking of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But what I know about the dictatorship of the proletariat is that the proletariat comes into government and it uses the state, and and the powers of the state. And Lenin, we talked about this last time, but Lenin thinks that it uses it in the same way that bourgeois, right, i.e. at that time liberal, right, liberal governments might use the state as well. So that might not be totalitarian necessarily, right? Although, of course, there has certainly been totalitarian socialist governments, right? But the totalitarianism is not just that we're using the state, not just that we're using the government, but actually we're going to reach down through the government and we're going to start using churches, clubs, organizations. The government is going to reach all the way down into society. All the different societal groups are going to be co-opted by the state in order to achieve complete national unity, complete harmony of national interests, and to harness all at once the whole power of the whole nation, not just the state, which, the state's a powerful instrument, right, for the socialists as well. And certainly the fascists are going to use it, but totalitarianism is going further than that, as you say, a step further, is down through the normal arms of government, through the normal agencies of government, into non-governmental organizations in society. As I said, like churches, although religion and fascism is difficult to square, but sports clubs, probably, any societal groups at all. So that's totalitarianism. And certainly totalitarianism is a stated goal of fascism, right? Fascism, as an ideology, wants to co-opt the whole nation, and that involves every group. And again, socialism has done that in the past. But I'm not sure if it's as central to the ideology. Although there's an argument there with the dictatorship of the proletariat. What would that look like? Of course, when you start to go past the dictatorship of the proletariat and get into the withering away of the state, now it's difficult to talk about totalitarianism in the same way, although not impossible. Anyway, let's not do it. So with fascism seeming only to take it one step further, wanting to control everything. Right? Socialism and liberalism share certain qualities, right? And the qualities that I'm hearing there are the Enlightenment ones that you stated first in the question, which they absolutely do. So if they share certain qualities, socialism and fascism arguably also share a few similarities. Then are there also similarities between fascism and liberalism, or are they two completely incompatible? And that's a very provocative question, because I want to immediately say, oh my gosh, no, there can't be any kind of society, right, between fascism and liberalism. I think on the basis that fascism is a complete rejection of the Enlightenment and liberalism is a complete embrace of the Enlightenment, that already starts to that's already a difficult thing to come back from, right? Those five philosophies. And certainly, when you think of the Second World War, right, you think of a battle between liberalism and fascism, to the very death, to the death of fascism in the end. It would have been the death of liberalism had it gone the other way, no doubt. So they do seem, fascism and liberalism do seem quite different. But also, I mean, so my first point was that, look, one accepts the Enlightenment, one rejects the Enlightenment, which of course is the same as socialism and fascism. And I wonder if revolution has something to do with it. And I wonder if, certainly totalitarianism, you're certainly thinking about totalitarianism here, I think, in terms of the link. And yes, I think both have used totalitarianism. Could liberalism use totalitarianism as well? And liberalism kind of gets off in some ways. It gets off because it's there first, right? It's the first. And so, it's hard to think of a liberal revolution, or is it? Maybe it's not. If we think of something like democratization, we might call it democratization movements in I'm thinking of Greece, Spain, and Portugal, right, in Southern Europe. But of course, in South America, probably you would see those too, right? So yeah, you could have a liberal revolution. But then I guess what's the thing that, because the reason why I'm thinking of revolution is, of course, revolutionary socialism wants a revolution and to install a dictatorship of the proletariat. Fascism also wants to overturn liberalism. And so they have that in common, at least the overturning of liberalism. But I think I think it's quite, well, and of course we've got Mussolini, right, who starts off as an ardent socialist and then is certainly one of the founders of fascism as a political ideology, right? So you have those roots, right, that might also be a comparison, a similarity. It's very hard for me to think of fascism and liberalism, though. The similarities between them. Yeah, so I'm going to leave that there. Hopefully that was a nice discussion around the Enlightenment and the position of liberalism, fascism, and socialism, how they oriented themselves towards the Enlightenment and how they relate to each other on those grounds, and then totalitarianism as well. So hopefully those aspects became clearer during that discussion. Here we go. We're going to get into nationalism pretty quickly. I am quite interested myself in nationalism, and so there was a few questions about nationalism, and I picked at least one here, maybe more. But let's have a look at it. I'm confused about how the book makes it seem like nationalism was not a thing until fascism made it a powerful force. So other ideologies such as liberalism and communism not using nationalism as a part of their ideologies at all. And I think no. I think you might be being slightly unfair to the book there. I think the book talks about sort of Napoleon, right, and the French Napoleon moving through Europe, and really that's oftentimes the beginnings of what we think of as nationalism. It comes from France, right? You got the French Revolution, and you've got Napoleon, and then you've got sort of the backlash against the conquests that Napoleon's making. Right? Here's this first of all this new technology, right? New technology called nationalism, where you can harness the power and the support of a whole nation now, and unite and harness that force. And Napoleon's using it to just run roughshod over other parts of Europe, the whole of Europe almost, that don't have this technology. And so the other peoples, I suppose, in Europe see this and they say, we need some of that nationalism that the French have got, and they sort of, and then now we get the rise of Italian fascism, nationalism. Man, I do not want to do what you think the book's doing. I do not want to make those things equivalent, because they're absolutely not. Nationalism and fascism, but I'm getting there. Okay, so nationalism, and I think the book tells us this, right? The nationalism rises up at the very beginning of the 19th century, and very end of the 18th century, maybe around the French Revolution. So nationalism comes about in that sort of a way, and it is like a technology. And again, I want to reiterate what we've said earlier, and this is a key point that I'd like you to note, that nationalism is this. The following is the definition of nationalism. Nationalism is simply the belief that the world is divided into multiple nations, and that those multiple nations play a significant role in world affairs. That's nationalism, right? So the socialists were quite anti-nationalist. At least Marx was quite anti-nationalist, and we covered this quite a bit in socialism, right? We talked about internationalism of Marx versus, well, at least the chapter did. Maybe we didn't focus too much on it because we were saving it for now for fascism. But Marx was an internationalist. You know, he thought the working class didn't have a nation state, right? Of course, when Lenin comes along and later Mao comes along, and certainly when we get to Stalin, right? We've got now socialism in one country. We do get some link between nationalism and socialism. With Marx, we don't really have that link. So for Marx, the only, the working class don't have a country. They don't have a nation. They're the working class. They're defined not by national identity, right, but by social identity, by social class identity. And so, and we'll get into this, right? But it talks about, in the book, it talks about Mussolini he's a socialist, remember, and the First World War, he sees the working class told over and over again by socialists, look, you're not going to fight. We're not going to fight one another. German working class and British working class are not going to war on behalf of the bourgeoisie. That's not in your interest. That's not in anybody's interest, right? Not in the working class interest. If the bourgeoisie want a war, let them fight it themselves. We're not fighting their wars. We're the working class. We have more in common with the German working class than we do with our British bourgeoisie. Right? Our interests are more aligned with the German working class. So within socialism, there is, at least early on, right, at least with Marx and before World War I, and before the Russian Revolution, there is an internationalism and a sort of a negation that, look, nations are not the important division in the world. They're not the significant one. The significant division is the class one, right? So that's sort of socialism versus nationalism, right? And of course, nationalism and socialism, in the Soviet Union do go hand in hand, and in China as well. And we saw that last time, a little bit at least. Where are we at now? So nationalism is not a thing until fascism made it a powerful political force. No, I disagree a little bit, and I think the book does talk about nationalism before the 20th century, right? And fascism is very much a 20th century ideology. And then we've already started to go into the second part of the question. So are other ideologies such as liberalism, communism not using nationalism? Absolutely not. No. Liberalism and nationalism is a little bit harder, but not that much harder. I suppose when I think of liberalism and nationalism, I think of the social contract or something like that, right? So maybe a nation in liberalism is that group of people that have decided together install a particular government. Now, that particular government, it has to be a government, you know, in order to have things like self-expression, right? In order to be, which I think is a good liberal tenet, right? You know, rule of the people, right? By the people, for the people. There has to be the people, right? Now, it's, I suppose, technically feasible, and maybe some of you might subscribe to this, right? And certainly, if we take universalism from Enlightenment, we could sort of build into liberalism some maybe idea of a great family of, you know, the people is everybody, right? And certainly there'll be tranches of liberalism that would go along with this, right? The whole world is one big the people, right? So we could have a world government. I think liberalism wouldn't be certainly strands of liberalism that wouldn't be against some sort of a world government, right? Which would then undermine the idea of nationalism. But most liberal states, most politics that follows the liberal ideology usually accept nationalism, right? Usually, think of the Second World War again, I suppose, right? We had liberal nation states defending their national territory, right, against fascist nation states usually, right? And so there's going to be some element of nationalism there, right, within liberalism. And so absolutely, I think liberalism and socialism, certainly strands of those have certainly adopted nationalism, and nationalism generally, right? It's sort of aside from any of these political ideologies, right? It's almost you know, like the Enlightenment is. It's an ism that, of course, liberalism's an ism too, but it's more of an epistemological point of view, right? Or maybe ontological, right? That, you know, what does the world look like? It's divided into nations, and then I suppose what I'm getting at is that's so fundamental, so elementary that's maybe a building block that can build into other ideologies, but on its own is not an ideology, absolutely, but also doesn't necessarily have to be with one particular ideology. Certainly conservatism, right, would have also, I missed conservatism before because we're not talking about it very much, but certainly that would have an idea of nation too. So yeah, I don't think, I think that's something that we should be careful of, especially when we talk about fascism. We should not in any way equate nationalism and fascism, especially in this class. So there's one more question about nationalism, and it goes like this: I am confused about the relationship between fascism and nationalism. Are they separate completely, or does nationalism lead to fascism? Fascists are nationalists, but nationalists, all fascists are nationalists, but not all nationalists are fascists, right? Because again, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit again here, but nationalism, it's fairly prosaic, it's fairly elementary. It's just the belief, again, it's only the belief that the world is divided into nations. Lots of people think that, right? And certainly, again, if I think of the Second World War, where we had liberalism versus fascism, also versus socialism, you know, certainly the liberal nation states absolutely had a sense of nationalism, right? A division of the world between British and Americans, right, and Germans and French and Japanese people and Chinese people. Certainly, there was that recognition there, and that's all there is. Now, sometimes people add a little bit on to nationalism, add on to that. Hey, nationalism is about thinking that my country is better than all the other countries. That's I wouldn't use that as a definition. I would, you know, that's maybe some sort of chauvinism. And in the book where it starts to talk about Herder, you know, Herder and Fichte, they are German philosophers, right? German intellectuals, who it is said in the book, sort of prefigure, sort of lay part of the groundwork for fascism. And they're nationalists, right? They're talking about nation. And they, one of the things that they say, right, is that we're part of a nation. Herder is much more linguistically focused. He thinks that, I don't think it says this in the book, but he thinks that, although it does allude to linguistics, but he thinks that nations are made by their language, right? Because we all speak different languages, right? Different nations speak different languages for Herder, and because each language has its own grammar and its own vocabulary, and those words and that grammar is used in different ways. Because of that, there's a character, right? A national character that separates. Now Herder doesn't mean that it'd be a big step from Herder to say, oh, well, one's better than the other. No, these early thinkers about nationalism thought that they had different qualities, right? That the different nations had different qualities, and but they were all great. They're all good nations. It's later on, right, when we start getting into some of the racial philosophy, some of the racial intellectualism towards the fin de siècle, right, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Gobineau and those sorts of people where they're of course they're breaking races out, but I think even then, right, it's really the fascists themselves that come along and they start to say, they build on it, right? They say, okay, yeah, there's different nations, yeah, they have different qualities, language maybe forms it. Also, we're going to marry it with a race now. We're going to say, that particular races belong in particular nations or belong to particular nations, and that now we're going to add on top of that, we're going to say that some races are superior to other races. Some nations, because they contain these people, are superior to other nations. Even that, even the fascists are going to even have to add something to that, right? Because we're superior and because you're inferior, now it doesn't matter. We're going to annihilate you. We're going to make more room for ourselves, right? Because we are more deserving of that land, those resources than you are. Now we're into fascism. We've come quite away from nationalism there. I think it was. I think that sort of narrative was inspired by your question: does nationalism lead to fascism? That's how it would, but it's not nationalism on its own. We've got to add a few things to nationalism. Once we've added a few things, now we're in a place where we're fascists, right? We've reached fascism. So I think that's a good explanation of that. Okay, I'm going to go down to the bottom of the questions, right, which is this one. Why did the counter-enlightenment people believe that reason was too weak to rely on? We'd have to read them, right? I suppose we'd have to read them more to get a fuller answer than this, right? But just there's just an assertion and I suppose a recognition that, look, yes, people appear to reason. They appear to make strong, rational, logical arguments. But what all they're doing really, say the counter-enlightenment people, all they're doing really is they are just rationalizing, right? They're just reasoning through. They're just the things that they want, unconsciously or consciously, but the things that they just want, that they're inclined towards, that they have impulses for, right? This is the irrationalism that we're going to talk about in a second. They have those irrational impulses, those inclinations, those desires from inside of themselves. And all they're doing when they're reasoning is just justifying what they already want inside, right? What they already think is the right thing to do. There's an element, and again, I don't like to, not only do I not like to mix up nationalism and fascism, but I also don't like to mix up conservatism and fascism because, well, they're very different, right? Fascism is very revolutionary, right? Which, remember, it's very innovative, extremely innovative, in the most extreme way. Conservatism wouldn't have anything to do with that, right? But we were talking about some of the commonalities between and among these ideologies, and the prejudice that Berg talks about, that seems irrational too, right? It's something that we want to be careful when we use the word prejudice because it has different connotations now. But these sort of inclinations, these prejudices, I think this is something that probably does unite fascism and conservatism, right? The reliance on that and the distrust of rationality, and the distrust of reason. And even in the book, I found like for fascism that it seemed like they were saying that for fascism there's almost just a denial that's reason isn't the true motivator. There's some other motivator, and reason is there to make that motivation, to hide that motivation maybe, or to make it seem like a better idea than it really is. So that's an idea. Yeah, and this is another question that let's stay on irrationalism. For this section, I'm wanting to know how fascism relates to irrationalism. And so we saw in those counter-enlightenment thinkers towards the fin de siècle, what we find is, well, remember that fascism is a rejection of the Enlightenment, and so one of the Enlightenment basis is reason or rationality, and so to reject that, you've got to go this way, which is irrationalism. But and fascism is an appeal to the irrational in us. It's an appeal. If you listen to some of the things that Mussolini says, and they're certainly quoted in the book, have a look at that. I mean, it oftentimes doesn't make what we would think of as sense, right? And it's not because it's not appealing to a reason. It doesn't want to appeal to reason. He wants to appeal to some sort of what we might be tempted these days to talk about as a sort of baser feelings, right? Our what is it? Some people sometimes say lizard brains or something like that, right? Our deep but not quite that biology, right? It's more of a subconscious, right? In the sense of Freud, that we have these motivations, these feelings, these fears, probably, right, inside of ourselves, and we're not even always completely rationally conscious of them, but they're there, they're lurking in, and fascism can appeal to those. Right? It can bring those feelings out in ways that we can't really explain, right? We want to feel and do things. Sorel, when he starts talking about the crowd, and you get in a crowd, and fascism draws on this, right? Think of the crowds that fascism speaks to. You get these crowds, and we'll start to behave in ways that we would never behave on our own. Right? This is some sort of a force there, some sort of an irrational. And think of Hegel, right? I think Hegel. We could sort of point back to this sort of spirit, but there's some sort of a force there that moves us, right? Almost without us really understanding it. Certainly without us understanding it, but almost without any kind of attempt to understand. We just behave out of impulse and reason. And so fascism, I don't know. I don't see fascism as seen as a good or a bad, like that's a right or a wrong thing to be motivated irrationally. But it just says that's the way things are. That's what people are like. People are motivated by the irrational. So there's no point in us appealing like the socialists did, right? When the socialists, I think this is I'm going to say this whole example again because I think it's completely relevant. When the socialists are being rational and saying, look, working class, you're being oppressed by the bourgeoisie. Your interest is with the working class of the Germans. Imagine we're talking to the British working class. That's an appeal to some sort of rationality there, right? Self-interest and being able to sort of weigh your options and decide what's best for me. But that's not what happens. But Mussolini sees that that's not what happens. People, the flag, the symbol, the national symbols, the appeals from the government, from the royal family, those appeals to our sentiment, to our feelings of national identity and national pride. They're more powerful. Mussolini sees that they are more powerful because look what happens. We do go to war in the First World War. We do go. The working class does go to war. And so clearly then, if you're looking at which was the more potent appeal, it wasn't the socialist interest of the working class appeal. It was the irrational national appeal. And so whether, fascism is not a question of, I think irrationalism is just a better way to live than rationalism. It's what's going to motivate the most people. People are not motivated by rationality, they're motivated by irrationality. So I suppose in terms of how does fascism relate to irrationalism, I would say, I'd suggest that irrationalism is a tool that fascism uses, that it sees as superior to any other tool of reason or that the liberals might want to use. Right? If you look at, if we read J.S. Mill, which I don't think we really did, not too much anyway, but if we had read it more, we would see all sorts of reasoned arguments. And the thing of Bentham, like utilitarianism, very based in reason, very universalist as well, utilitarianism, like that it's all about pleasure and pain. Human beings want to have pleasure and they want to avoid pain. And so let's run the government in such a way that we maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain, for the bigger number of people. That's very rational. It's very rational. But fascism denies that. In fact, fascism asks you to suffer pain, right? It asks you to suffer and to die for your nation, and they think that that's the stronger motivator. So, well, we're back up to the top now. I went sort of down to the bottom and then up to the top. We've covered quite a bit there, I think, about again the relationship between fascism and nationalism, irrationalism, generally the Enlightenment we've talked about. This is a good place to be. We've mentioned the counter-enlightenment thinkers. I've mentioned some of them by name. It's good because what I like about that section in the textbook is that it shows how fascism, it's a collection of stuff that was already out there. Right? It's new to the 20th century, but it's taking bits of stuff that's already out there, and the stuff itself, right, is not fascism. Herder on his own, we can't call him a fascist. He can't be a fascist because he's missing quite a lot of the things that he would need. The bits that we have to add on to his ideas of nation and nationalism. People, Fichte, the same. Freud, I mentioned Freud. We can't call Freud a fascist, but his ideas were taken and used and added to those ideas of Fichte, of Herder. Who else? Gobineau as well. Gobineau I'm a bit more wary of, but still, I mean, none of these people on their own, and none of these ideas on their own, like nationalism on its own, or any of these ideas, they're not fascism. But fascism is a collection of those ideas and plus something, right? Plus something else. In the case of nationalism, right? Plus chauvinism, right? Plus maybe imperialism, right? Or expansionism. And you put those all those together, and then you get something that's very fascist. But on its own, it's absolutely not fascist. Anyway, very interesting. I will check out your questions later on in the week, and do another one of these videos where we'll bring out even more, I think, from fascism. And yeah, all the best to you. Hope things are going well for you, that you're not suffering too badly under the current circumstances, and keep in touch.